And now I will continue with our session. So our second speaker today is Peter Stokes. He is a research professor in digital and computational humanities applied to historical writing in Paris at EPHE. After honors degree in classics and English literature and in computer engineering at the University of Melbourne in Australia, he completed a PhD at the University of Cambridge on English palaeography of the early 11th century. His current primary research focus is on theoretical and practical questions around the description and analysis of handwriting, particularly multigraphism, and in medieval Europe, combining the field of paleography, digital humanities, and computer science. I personally had the honor and privilege to meet and talk to Peter Stokes a few times. He is a humble and kind scholar with great insights and ideas on digital handwriting analysis. It is always wonderful to listen to him. So without more talking, I invite Professor Dr. Peter Stokes to present his talk for today on writer identification. Peter.
Thank you very much. I'll share the screen. I hope that's working. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and for the conference, which I'm finding extremely interesting and rewarding. And I'm looking forward to more discussion to come. As mentioned, I'm not a Hebrew or Aramaic expert at all. And so the examples that I'm going to be talking about are coming from the domain that I know, namely the English material, but only as examples. And the point is very much methodological. So I hope the connections will be very clear. And I'm going to very much pick up on some of the points that we were just discussing. And I've been discussing for a very long time, and it's always very good to see the interesting things that are always coming out of the group in Groningen. But my approach to digital is a little bit different, partly because I'm not a computer scientist, and so I'm leaving that to the people who are, but also because I think in addition to computers for answering questions, there is also another benefit, which is something that actually Knut, among many others, mentioned. Now, Knut, one of the forefathers, if you like, of computer science, that sometimes the best way to understand something is to know it so well that you can teach it to a computer. And he went on to say that the process of seeking such explanations will surely be instructive to all concerned. And so that's partly where I'm coming from, is to say not only do we want the work that's coming out of Groningen and elsewhere on the identification and so on, but also just the process of what from a computer science AI point of view is very old-fashioned and very not necessarily interesting, can still have some value here. So what I want to really talk about, they are reflections, they're nothing more than that. They're not the same level of rigor that some of the talks we've seen so far. But to come back to the question of writer identification and think about some ways to perhaps move in slightly different directions. By which I mean, this first one paper has been cited a number of times now. There's a big discussion about this yesterday. And I think the question that's posed here really is absolutely the key question, particularly this point, whether perceived differences in handwriting are significant in the result of there being two different writers, or insignificant from the point of view of writer identification, because they're the result of normal variations within the handwriting of the same writer. And we had this debate sort of live in the session yesterday around the interpretation of the results. And this comes back to questions of trust and reliability and so on. Certainly knowing the degree to which we can or cannot interpret the results. And I think it's still the case, Lambert, that the results of Monk and elsewhere still, they're looking for the human interpretation. So the question always to me is how we can address that and help with this human interpretation. In many ways, this was part of the point of the Digipal, this question of variation and how much variation can we expect within a scribe. And if you haven't seen it, this is just a quick snapshot. So this is about creating letter table charts, the sorts of things we were discussing about yesterday, with the difference that not only can you do it by letter form, you can also do it by component. So here, showing me examples of letters with have descenders. written by the same scribe. And yes, if we can debate details about whether we want all the letters and so on, it's just to show where things are at the moment. But one of the things it gives you is some indication, at least, of the degree of variation. But thinking about more the process of human writer identification, in other words, how paleographers go about identifying, and beginning to wonder if there isn't another aspect that could usefully be brought in. And here, I think we're connecting to the discussions of multidimensionality and other areas of writing, because as we're starting to say, not exclusively, but the image tends to be one of the key points, obviously, in automatic identification. But of course, it's not the only point that paleographers and others use. And at least in some cases, I think this probably can be brought in to some of the automated analyses. The more I think about it, the more I think perhaps the key word that needs to be added in addition to variation might also be continuity and discontinuity. So let me illustrate what I mean in what will start off with something very simplistic and get a bit more interesting, I hope. And I hope, again, the analogies will be very clear for the Qumran material and indeed elsewhere. But first, very quickly, an overview of the context that I'm talking about. Very roughly speaking, there was a significant transition in the style of writing, which makes things interesting very paleographically, partly because there were different influences on the script, so some coming from continental, for want of a better term, for writing in Latin, but not in English. In addition, political disruption, so the historical and cultural elements affecting the handwriting, and very, very significant intra and inter-writer variation, as far as we can tell. Now, yes, there's a certain circularity here. If we can't identify hands, then how can we know that? But it seems clear that a given writer, at least in this period, showed a lot of variation in writing, and also that different writers seem to show very significant variation from one to the other. This is a subjective paleographical analysis for sure. But it's like we can do more quantitative analysis of this as well. And this seems fairly clear to stabilize in national script. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take this example. This is a very famous manuscript. It's the only surviving copy of Beowulf, which is an Old English epic poem. And I think probably to everyone, it's fairly clear cut that there is a very significant change, even to the eye, probably even to an expert eye, where the shape of the letters, the allograph selection, the strokes, the way the pen is cut, the way the pen is held, all these things are very significantly different from one to the next. So clearly we have a discontinuity in the style of writing, and there is not a continuity in the text in the sense that it continues directly on. You probably can't see that, but that is the case. The manuscript, by the way, was badly damaged in fire. That's why it looks that way. But we have the whole manuscript, and so we have the context. There is no codicological or other change there. So what's going on? Well, normally there'd be a fairly straightforward assessment. There's a significant discontinuity in allograph ligature selection, structure of strokes, the cut, the angle of pen, and so on and so forth. So there's significant variation, or a significant distance, let's say, between the first and second part of the page, with a very, very clear change, a clear discontinuity, and no obvious other explanation. So we would assume different scribes. Okay, nothing particularly surprising or different there. Another example, though, is a little bit more complicated and a little bit more interesting. Here again, we have two different pages of a manuscript. And if it's enlarged that a bit and look at some of the, again, the ligature, the allograph selection, the choice of ligatures, the proportions and strokes, even details. I'm not sure if you can see it at home, but the strokes here are much fuzzier around the edges and are quite differently formed compared to the very clear and distinct strokes here. Again, a very clear distance, at least from a subjective point of view, and I'm taking as given that the quantitative analysis would be the same. But that may not be the case, and it is interesting, would be interesting to check. But the point here is that there is no discontinuity in the script. And in fact, if you look through it, this appears to be exactly the sort of thing that we were discussing yesterday, where a scribe begins imitating the new fancy script, which is supposed to be used coming in from the continent. And gradually you can see him, I assume, changing and dropping back into his original script. So even though on the face of it, these look entirely different, and if this survived in fragments, there would be no question normally that these are written by different scribes. In fact, the lack of discontinuity, the continuity, seems to suggest the interpretation, at least, that it's the same scribe throughout. The fuzziness I mentioned is almost certainly because the parchment is not well prepared. And so the flesh and the hair sides, the two sides, are very different in the way that the ink has taken. And as I said, the script itself is very unstable in this period. So by combining the historical, contextual, and other aspects, we can come to a subjective humanistic conclusion that it's most likely to be the same. And again, yes, it would be interesting to confirm this with more quantitative methods. But assuming that is the case, this is a different interpretation of what, on the face of it, may seem to be very similar data. There are many other examples of that, by the way. It seems to be a trend where scribes start in one way and slide back to what I imagine is the earlier performance. And there are other cases in other contexts as well. These are just ones that I'm familiar with that I'm showing here. This one here, though, is a little bit more complicated again, because in this case, we have very similar allograph selection, very similar strokes, slightly different pen and slightly different orientation and so on. So we might imagine it's a different scribe, perhaps. This is a period where script is very stable, relatively speaking. We're now into the second half of the 11th century. But again, there's an interesting detail here. The text we are talking about is a chronicle, a historical text detailing year by year different events that have taken place. And the change in the writing, in this case, aligns, as you can see, very precisely with this, the number, Roman numerals 1052. This is the year 1052. And this is exactly the point where the script changes. So one interpretation, at least, due to the alignment of discontinuities, textual and paleographical, is that perhaps this is the same scribe a year later coming back and adding an entry. And we see this going year after year, these same entries, each changing at each year. Whether it's the same scribe or not, of course, is more difficult to say. And there are questions about the variation from one year to the next. But again, it's another case where if we just had the two parts separately, we may come to a different conclusion compared to the combination and the alignment of these different discontinuities. So here again, we have clear changes in style, pen color, and so on. Relatively little difference in allograph selection. But in this period, we do see this in very different hands. Again, yes, there's a possibility of circularity here, but in cases where we're sure they're very different and distant, we still see similar allograph selection. But the fact that we have this coincidence of textual boundaries would suggest the possibility, at least, of the same scribe coming back a year later. Here's another similar example. In this case, they are records added into a book of manumissions, actually. These are slaves who are being released or who have bought their freedom. And again, it looks, in terms of the script and allographs and so on, it's very similar, but there are clear differences between them. And again, the fact that the small differences in script align with the textual discontinuities would suggest that it could be the same person. In this case, we know it's the same place because these are records related to Bath, which is written here. It's probably not very clear to you, but Bath in southwest England. And so again, the assumption is we know the place, we know roughly the date, we can see the script. Probably it's the same person coming back at different dates, but we only know that because of the textual content and the alignment of discontinuities. I'm going very quickly through these, and I'm very happy to come back to them in discussion, but I don't want to take too much time, just to pose examples and problems in a sense, and how we might be addressing these questions both digitally and if we did not have this contextual information. Here we have another example of this chronicle text. It's a different version, a different manuscript, but here something else is going on, and this to me still is quite puzzling. We do have a clear difference. You can see the color of the ink, the shape, the form of the strokes, the pen cut, and so on. But here, curiously, it's not the start of the annal for that particular year. It's sort of one phrase in. And in fact, we see this systematically over and over again in this manuscript. The scribe writes the first phrase or so, this sort of syntactic element, stops, and then comes back, somebody else comes along. Again, it's not very clear, but because we do not have the same alignment of discontinuities between text and changing script, it's much harder to draw conclusions about scribal and writer identity and what's happening here or not happening here. So again, in this case, changes in style, pen, and so on clearly delimited, but they do not coincide with textual boundaries. We would normally expect less inter-hand variation. So perhaps a different scribe from the same place. Again, it's difficult to say. And I can go on with other examples. This is another phenomenon we find fairly often where, so a couple of people jokingly call the toilet break scribe, where somebody intervenes for just a few lines, and then it seems to go back to the same scribe. And again, we find a lot of examples of this sort of thing. And very often, as here, the intervening scribe looks to be from a slightly later date. It's a slightly later script from an intuitive palaeographical point of view. How we interpret this, again, is another question. But it's another case of discontinuities in the script, but not in the text or codicology or anything else, which would normally suggest different scribes. And very quickly, and I'm sure clearly I'm running out of time. Yet another example here where there's a discontinuity in the script. Probably you can see there's a difference in allograph selection, difference in the fluency, the regularity of the script. But here something else is going on, because here there is a linguistic change from Latin to English. And what appears to be the case here is that it's the same scribe, but it's probably, knowing the historical context, a Norman scribe who probably doesn't know English. And as the linguistic context changes, so the fluency in the writing and the strokes and so on change. And this, again, is producing, even to the eye, distinctive differences and variation in the script. And one more at the end, a note added. These last few words are thought to have been potentially added by another scribe. But what it actually says here is essentially, this work is now finished. God help my hands. My hands are so tired, I can't write it anymore. Attached at the end there. Would that have an impact on the writing? Presumably, yes. Not to mention cases like these where there's clearly, this is a scribe showing off these different scripts. How on earth we identify scribes here? Or another one of my favorites is the Hebrew and the Chinese written by the same person. How on earth we can address this sort of question is a whole other discussion entirely. So anyway, where I'm going with this partly is as cautions, given the discussion we had yesterday, and given that yesterday, for instance, in the Isaiah scroll, there was the codicological and other discontinuities. So maybe these are things we need to take into account. I mean, not that they're not taken into account, but perhaps a bit more so. I think to some extent we can outline these propositions. Of course, they're not clearly rigorous, but sorts of things that maybe could be introduced into the evidence and the discussion that is being used, including changes in codicological and other units. Now, this has to some extent been done in a different context. And this is a book which, granted for the scrolls, is not so immediately relevant. But what they did was worked through in a purely humanities, but quite rigorous way, different types of continuity and discontinuity, and worked through the logic of what these continuities mean and do not mean. It's only in French, but they are working on an English version and update, and they very much hope that will come out soon. And so these sorts of things can, in principle, be incorporated. And just to show some of the things we did in the Exxon Doomsday project, which is one that's online, I'll show you the link later, which is not at all machine vision or artificial intelligence or any of these things, but it's about trying to encode some of this information in ways that we can look here, for instance. This is a mapping of scribal, codicological, and other continuities and discontinuities so that we can see points where they align. This mapping was generated automatically from a catalog description as a way of saying there is something going on here. Why don't we go and have a look at it? And another here, this is work, the codification visualization is done by Alberto Campagnolo, Porter, and others. And again, I appreciate it's not relevant as such for scrolls, but again, it's a way of automatically mapping these different divisions and different units and another type of information that could be brought into some of this discussion. So I'm definitely out of time and carried on a bit too long, but here are some other possibilities to add into the general discussion. And I was going to mention this, which is I think probably one of my favorite quotes, but I definitely don't have time for that anymore. So if you have a discussion, we can come back to it. But for now, I will stop there. There's some references. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was wonderful to listen to you again. Thank you very much. I'm waiting to see. I don't see any question yet, so maybe we can have a couple of minutes now to, if it is okay for you, to go back to the last slide and talk a bit.
Maru.
Okay, so
I could ask a question, maybe. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Peter. Yeah, maybe we'll take Gemma's question now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh, hello. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh.
Gemma, we can hear you. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm in a room with somebody else, so my volume was completely off, and he had to turn his volume. Sorry. Thank you very much for your talk, Peter. It's always lovely to listen to you talk about how to identify scribes and writers and things like that. So my question is going to be, in your ideas of continuity and discontinuity, where exactly do features of letters and strokes fit in with the general textural appearance, and which do you put more weight on? And I think you probably understand my question. So
Yes.
just kind of talk to that, and also maybe where do paleographic charts fit into this as well?
Yes, well, as of course, this is a huge and perhaps the question, and this to some extent comes back to what Lambert was just talking about with trust and reliability and so on. And the fact is, I think that the letter charts and so on are easier to understand and more explainable. Does that mean they are more reliable? No, not necessarily. And it's an interesting observation I have heard from some paleographers who have said there is a tendency amongst people perhaps with less of hands-on paleographical experience to overemphasize allograph selection, metaforms and so on, compared to other things. And it's interesting talking to people like Michael Gallick, who is, again, works more in my period, but he's a calligrapher as well as a paleographer. And the sorts of features that he looks for are very different from the sorts of features that a lot of others. So he emphasizes things like rhythm and regularity of strokes. And I think there's at least one Sylvester in the audience that might be interesting to have that point of view as well, to see that there is a different way of looking at things. So I think this is where the interest of the Groningen approach is, to be able to, in a sense, bypass that and get at the more fundamental details. The question, as we were just discussing, is how to make that, how to either demonstrate the reliability, or if we can't do that, how to make it trustworthy and intelligible. So that's not really an answer, but I'm not sure there is a simple answer.
No, it is. It's definitely an answer. So thank you very much. I will respond, but there might be other questions.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma. We'll take another question if it is okay with you. So we have also Ayhan Aksu, and he also wants to ask a question. So Ayhan, you can unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I was really intrigued by that one example of this scribe that wrote in Latin and then moved to English, and you could see it in kind of the way, the fluency of his handwriting. And I was wondering if there are more, if you found more examples of this, and whether we could also, you know, turn this argument around, and perhaps if there's one scribe that where you don't see this inconsistency in handwriting between languages, if that would mean that perhaps he was fluent in multiple languages, or maybe I'm pushing the argument a bit too farther.
Well, so yes, it is an interesting question, and it's a little bit complicated by the fact that there is also the different styles of writing in English and Latin. So it's not always clear whether it's the change in style or the change in language that's causing the problem. And this is where, again, some of the more quantitative analyses would be interesting, because one of my arguments for a long time is that there has been a tendency to say scribes writing in English wrote more sloppily than those writing in Latin because Latin is a more important language, blah, blah, blah. I'm not convinced that's true. I suspect it's more because of the shapes of the letters look sloppier. So and this is where, coming back to the other question from Gemma, the rhythm I think is quite useful. So here you can see the strokes just by eye, the strokes are very irregularly spaced and different. And that suggests fairly clearly hesitation, may not be linguistically, maybe because of the letters. In other cases, for instance, the one I showed quickly at the start with the descenders, it's very, very striking. This is a very skilled scribe, at least by eye. And by eye, there is no real difference. He chooses the letters differently, but he moves very smoothly back and forth between them. So in a case like that, I would hypothesize that yes, he is very happy writing both. One of the things I wanted to do and haven't yet managed is to map this out more systematically. But my gut feeling is that it's after the Norman conquest of 1066 that you see this much more. And in the late Anglo-Saxon period, even when writing Latin, most of them seem reasonably happy doing that, which, if that's true, that actually overturns quite a lot of what we think about learning and education in England. But again, that would require more quantitative analysis of the things that have been going on in Groningen, I think, to support it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
And thank you very much, Peter Stokes. We have one more from Drew Longaker about multigraphism, but because of time, we'll pass it to the discussion after this, the last presentation. So thank you again, Peter Stokes, for your nice presentation.